Okay. Welcome to the inaugural Australasian Society of Physical Activity interview series. My name is Erica Hickson. I'm an executive committee member of ASPA, that's the acronym. And today with us, we have two very important guests, Hamish McEwan, Intelligence Team Manager at Sport New Zealand, and Dr. Justin Richards, the Academic Lead for Sport New Zealand. Thank you both for joining us today. Let's start with your roles. What do they entail? And I would also like to know your initial reaction to the formation of this new society. Hamish, can we start with you?
Tēnā koutou, ko McEwan, tōku ingoa, no taputeranga o, ko manager mo ihi Aotearoa, ko Hamish aho, tēnā koutou. Good morning, my name is Hamish McEwan. I am the Intelligence Manager at Sport New Zealand. It's a role I've been in now for about 5 years with the organisation. Broadly, the role encompasses, I'd say, 4 main areas of work. We have a research program that includes a number of national surveying tools and instruments that we use to understand broadly physical activity behaviour in New Zealand, but also the experience of New Zealanders inside play, sport and active recreation systems, and a number of tools that also look into school environments in particular. Accompanying that, we have an evaluation team that focuses mainly on our large-scale evaluations, but also supports more broadly our investment role to understand how our investments are operating and how successfully they are working. We have a third area, an academic program, which Justin leads, and he will talk about shortly. And the fourth area of our work really involves how we're using data and analytical tools to understand both behaviour, using novel instruments to track behaviours, be it looking at social media or looking at purchase behaviour. And there's an associated data environment that's built and managed by the intelligence team at Sport New Zealand.
Great, thank you very much. Justin.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Justin no Madraba o, ki te noho ki Petone. Ko aho te academic lead mo ihi Aotearoa. Tēnā koutou katoa. So, hi there, my name's Justin. I'm actually from, and you can probably tell the accent, a place in Australia called Madraba, which means place of sticky dirt. It's on the Gold Coast in Queensland, that's where I'm originally from. But I'm from Kiwi heritage, and I live now in a place called Petone near Wellington. I'm the academic lead, as Hamish referred to, for Sport New Zealand. And in that role, I have 2 main tasks, and that is to engage the tertiary sector of New Zealand in helping us answer some of the tricky questions that we need to answer. So we work with academics, or we're working on developing our work with academics to ensure we're addressing some of the gritty questions that we need to consider in physical activity and sport in New Zealand and more broadly. And the other part that I am heavily involved with is contributing to the development of surveillance of physical activity in New Zealand. So understanding not only physical activity itself, but its determinants of physical activity and what happens as the consequences of being active. Now, a reaction, the second part of your question, a reaction to the formation of ASPA. Look, I see this as a fantastic opportunity. I see these societies as an opportunity to bring together people who come from different spaces. And what I was really encouraged about when I saw that ASPA was being formed was its focus on bringing together academia, so research with policy and with practice. I think that we spend a lot of time in our silos often, and we spend time with researchers doing research, policymakers doing policy, and practitioners doing their practice, and sort of dipping into each other's spaces if and when we need to, rather than focusing on, well, what is the added value of us finding a space where we can all be comfortable and all together. So that's the exciting thing for me. I also think the exciting thing is that there are unique things that are happening in this part of the world, in our region. And and it's an opportunity for us to talk about that and you know, harness our similarities, but also recognise our differences and create a platform for those unique things that are happening. And the third thing that I would say that's exciting for me about this is that we've got some countries around us which we can bring along for the journey too, that may be missed by an international society, but in a more regional way. We can bring the Pacific Islands and the Asian countries which maybe haven't got as established physical activity profiles as Australia and New Zealand do. We can bring them along in a more local way than perhaps an international society might. So that's the excitement for me about the formation of ASPA. Thank
you for sharing that. That's very well said. The next question I think needs to be around COVID-19. And aren't we lucky that as a country we are COVID-19 free? How has Sport New Zealand responded to COVID-19, and what do we know about changes in physical activity in New Zealand during that time?
Thank you, Erica. We'll do a little bit of a tag team with Justin as we go through some of this, where I'll talk probably about some of the broader responses that we've gone as an organisation. Justin will touch on some of the adult physical activity work we've seen, and I'll touch on some of the children piece. To start with, in terms of Sport NZ's reaction and response, broadly, it's been manic, I think would be the first thing that I think everyone would reflect on. The disruption to our system, to people's activity has resulted in a great deal of focus on how organisations continue to operate and support. Mm-hmm. Broadly, as a play, active, recreation and sports system, it generally has not very deep pockets is probably the easiest way to describe it. So financial stability has been a core focus for organisations in the initial stage, and we pretty quickly set up a funding mechanism we described it as keep the lights on with a number of organisations over the COVID period or over the main lockdown period. And that's going to continue to be quite a focus for us for at least the next 3 to 6 months, so out towards the end of 2020, as those disruptions continue. We did some modelling work quite early on to look at what the estimated financial impacts are into the system. Now, those things were driven off what we knew at the time, and things in New Zealand context have recovered probably quicker than we would have imagined 3 months ago. Mm-hmm. But still, there are significant shortfalls. So the funding environment and the operation of the system remains pretty central at the moment. And we were fortunate through the government to receive a substantial budget bid allocation to help support the sector that was informed by forecast lost revenues to the system. So that's enabled us to create at least some stability to our partners, people that we invest into, and to organisations we don't invest into. In terms of right down at the community level, we have funds operating. Within more of a operational sense, other than the direct partner support, which has been the majority of what we've been doing, we've set up a number of specific research pieces to help us understand. So we set up pretty quickly off the back of our national survey, which actually had to stop, which was an interesting challenge for us. We're no longer able to mail out our survey, which was part of its mechanism. We set up a cohort study. Or a fairly pragmatic cohort study that we did in pretty short order, and we're just about to go out a second time, and that's we're looking at continuing over time, and Justin will talk a little bit about some of the results from the adult portion in a minute. But that's really what the organisation has done in a response sense. It is resulting in how we look a little bit around our structures going forward, especially with how we manage significant new investments into the system, and that we normally don't have. So just for a relative quantum, we invest about 50 million per year. Mm-hmm. The government has given us an extra $264 million over 4 years. So that's substantially different. So from an organisational perspective, that's really interesting. And you can imagine a lot of interest from the sector in how that money gets spent. So there's a fair bit of stakeholder management going on. We have set up a specific program around our futures, so looking at how we reimagine the future, and I know we'll touch on that later on in the interview today to go into a little more depth. But essentially, there were sort of three main work programs: a recovery, which is the longer term; a response, which is more the medium term; and then there was the immediate support. So we actually did a little bit of structural change inside of Sport NZ to support it. We're now winding that back at this stage going forward. Justin, did you want to touch a little bit on the results from the adults survey that we've conducted?
Yeah, look, so as Hamish mentioned, we had to temporarily suspend our ongoing national survey on Active NZ, on activity in NZ, in New Zealand, which is Active NZ. And that was replaced by what we're calling a pragmatic cohort, and essentially what we've got there is we've got a bunch of people around the country who have previously responded to Active NZ in the last 3 to 3.5 years. And so we have data on them and their physical activities and their determinants of activity. And some of them have agreed, or a large proportion of them have agreed for us to contact them again. And so we've gone back to those people who agreed for us to recontact them. And we've collected some information again about their physical activity and their behaviour. So we've actually got previous data from these people about their behaviour around physical activity, and then we've got current physical activity information about them when we're in different stages, essentially, of that response to COVID, so different stages of lockdown. And what we saw in this initial stage of lockdown, when things were really quite tight in New Zealand and comparative to the rest of the world, we had quite severe lockdown put in place, which has clearly reaped the benefits that we're seeing now. But we had these tight restrictions put in, and what we saw, particularly in adults, in our preliminary results, is we've seen changes which indicate that physical activity levels may have actually, or opportunities to be active, may have actually increased in adults. But what we're seeing is a differential in different population groups. So where we had before, where we had differences according to, say, deprivation or socioeconomic status, those differences have actually been exacerbated. So that's something which is of concern in COVID, and something that we need to be thinking about as we move out of our lockdown period in New Zealand. What we also saw, though, was that certain groups that previously were less active seemed to be more active. And one of those groups was, we'd previously seen in New Zealand that females had been less active than males. And we saw that actually that evened itself up, and that females saw more opportunity to be active than usual during the COVID response period. So a way to think about that for us is, well, what's happened during this period that we can now embrace and try and hold on to going forward, so that we don't sort of rebound back to where we were pre-COVID in that particular group. The other thing that we saw some differences in across different age groups. So our preliminary results sort of indicate that older New Zealanders have done reasonably well in terms of their physical activity during breakdown. So that's people 55 plus, even more so if you're older than that. But we did see a gap open up where people who are sort of in the 18 to 24-year-old range, where their opportunities to be active or their levels of activity seem to drop away. And considering what we know is likely to happen, or what is happening economically in the country and the well-being of those people, this may be something which we may be particularly important for us to think about when we think about, well, what's happening to jobs and job security, particularly in those younger age groups, and the role that physical activity might play in sustaining that in the time ahead. Hamish, we also had some results for the younger people. I think you're probably more across that than I am just now.
Yeah, so some similarities and some differences to the results we saw for the adult population. So with young people, overall, their physical activity levels dropped quite a lot through the lockdown. When we sort of reviewed what sort of stopped, the organised component was obviously taken away during the severe lockdown. And while we can't draw any conclusions from it, that's kind of the activity that stopped and didn't appear to get overly replaced. So it's a bit of a hypothesis, but about 40% of kids' overall activity is generally, we would classify into organised, be it with a coach or through a team structure. That just went and it wasn't replaced through it. So key things for us to consider is, how does it restart? how through school mechanisms and club mechanisms does that restart? What are the ongoing impacts and views around hygiene into the system, whether that impacts those going back? So that's quite interesting. I think it's too early to say. As we now look at surveying during what we consider level 1 in New Zealand, which is pretty much back to normal except for the borders being closed, we will be really interested to see what return occurs. But broadly, there was a reduced activity. It was exacerbated in a couple of population groups, not as clearly in high deprivation, but it was there as for adults, but much more clearly in the 15 to 17-year-old age bracket, stretching maybe a little bit down to 12 to 17, but clearly the older end of the conversation of young people, or how we classify them, and certainly amongst Asian populations, it dropped really dramatically. Why? We don't know. Whether that's, it's a very broad category when we talk about Asian populations. We've got Indian and Chinese, and we know their behaviours are very different, but that dropped a lot. So that's quite interesting and important for us to understand. But it'll be a bit of a watching brief as we go back and look again and again over time to see what the ongoing impacts of COVID will be. Justin, did you want something to add?
Yeah, just building on what we saw in terms of changes as well. I mean, and again, talking about the adult data and parallels there, what we did see in the adult data was the drop off as well in the organised physical activity. But what we saw was this real embracing of walking and cycling and yoga as terms of physical activity that was changing. So things that you can essentially do out your front door. And those are real opportunities, I think, for us to grab. What also came up, and another piece of work that we've been doing around looking at what's happening in social media and picking up the trends that are happening there, is the word walking has come up a lot in conversations around physical activity. So this really triangulates what we're seeing in the change of data. And I think we've really got an opportunity on our hands here for walking and local walking in our neighbourhoods to be embraced, and for people to realise you can be active out your front door, and that's really good for you. So that opportunity is something which I think we really need to grab here in Aotearoa in our time ahead.
Also linked with that social media analysis around walking, we saw people making the direct reference towards being active and their mental health, being active and their general well-being. So we're seeing people understanding the relationship between physical activity and their mental health and their well-being. And what we did see through the lockdown, we had a daily briefing from the Prime Minister and Director General of Health. And during lockdown, they said, go for a walk. Now, we can't draw any direct conclusions from it, but you're saying, well, that was a great message. So how do we keep that message alive?
Great. Thank you very much for your responses. Some very interesting results and so much for us to consider. So thank you very much. And great response from Sport New Zealand, and great news about the funding, the additional funding. That's fantastic. Now, before COVID-19, Sport New Zealand had developed an outcomes framework. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? And in particular, what were the drivers for its development, and what does it look like, and what makes it known?
Yeah, thank you, Erica. I'll kick off on this one, and Justin will add in some of the detail as we go. We didn't set out to build an outcomes framework really at the beginning. What the impetus was for this work was the government's wellbeing agenda. So the New Zealand government developed something, its Living Standards Framework, which was based on some OECD models around looking at human capital, social capital, financial capital, and natural capital. So an economic-based model looking at broader outcomes than purely economic outcomes. And at the time, our board at Sport New Zealand was interested in how does Sport New Zealand articulate its value into government. And the government had created a Living Standards Framework. And so the question that was really posed to the team was, how do we do this? How do we demonstrate our value in And at that time, Justin had been working on a document called The Value of Sport. It actually just recently completed it. And really it was the value of being physically active. And so we'd built a body of evidence around what global evidence existed for the benefits of being active. Well, that played really well into the government's living standards framework. What we did though is we took that living standards framework and started mapping what we knew about the values that physical activity brought and mapped them into the living standards framework. Treasury kept evolving what they did, and they ended up developing 12 capitals, 12 well-beings that sit within the living standards framework. And from there, that's really the beginning of our outcomes framework. We developed an approach where we looked at all of the 12 well-being domains that they had identified, and we actually did a logic mapping process going, how does play, sport, physical activity, active recreation map into each one of those domains? And we built essentially a logic model that has become our outcomes framework. And through that process, we built the evidence that showed how the connections work right through into the capitals. And as we came out the bottom, what ended up coming out was a socio-ecological model for behaviour change. So we identified long-term outcomes that we are ultimately responsible for. And there was a bit of a pragmatic judgment call because there's lots of things that we can contribute to, but where are the core contributions? So we identified really 3 primary long-term outcomes that we're aiming for. And then underneath, the socio-ecological model of behaviour change fed into those long-term outcomes. And that's fundamentally become our outcomes framework. It was something that our board and our minister endorsed, and it's now framing our work. We've put a date on it out to 2032. So for the next 12 years, these are the outcomes we're working towards, and that's flowed into a whole myriad of work programs, including some quite novel areas around subjective wellbeing analysis, to build some economic models to say, well, what is the wellbeing value and how can we have a conversation when we're talking about investment into our sector and return on investment and cost benefit analysis using wellbeing analysis, which is one of those novel areas that have come out. And then also out of that is the refinement of our national tools. So our surveying and questions align up through our outcomes framework, and that links into our broader surveillance system. So it's sitting very, very centrally through our strategy and all of our objectives. Justin, is there something that you sort of want to add to that conversation?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things thinking about, so Hamish mentioned the 3 long-term outcomes that we're looking for, and to actually put some words on that. So the 3 long-term outcomes essentially are what's happening to physical activity levels in Aotearoa, what are the experiences of people when they're physically active, and underpinning that cultural vitality. So what are the what's the availability of opportunities for all New Zealanders to be active? And so what we're looking at there is, yeah, we want to change people's physical activity. Yes, when we do it, we want them to be having a good time and we want them to enjoy that because we believe that that is linked with their long-term participation in physical activity. And underpinning that, we actually need to make sure that people have the opportunity to be active in ways that they want to be. And so they're our long-term outcomes that have come from that. And they feed into our, our role in government. And so the way we're using this, and Hamish touched on this, is that in the way we're investing, in the way we're thinking about using our resources at Sport New Zealand with our partners, is that we want to see how initiatives in New Zealand are feeding into the bottom of that outcomes framework, affecting the different parts of the socio-ecological model. And by doing that, we can actually map, and this comes back to some of my work around surveillance, we can actually map and measure how different initiatives across the country are actually feeding all the way through to the well-being of New Zealanders. And so that's some of the concept behind how we're going to be using that outcomes framework as well.
Fantastic, thank you. My final question, very important question, post-COVID-19, what does the future of sport and physical activity look like in New Zealand? How is Sport New Zealand planning and imagining the future?
That's a great question. I can't answer. I don't know what the future looks like. But what we can talk a little bit around is how we're approaching thinking about it. I mentioned earlier we had a recovery work program, which is one of the work programs that both Justin and I are involved in at Sport New Zealand. And a central piece of that is some futures work. So using futures approaches, we are actually developing a consultation process with our sector that'll run over the next 4 to 5 months, that's informed by the evidence that we're collecting through the likes of Active New Zealand, our national survey, and through the cohort study. It's also informed by what do we understand around where we get the greatest return and impact through some of our subjective wellbeing analysis. And it's also going to be informed by some system mapping work. So what we're doing in terms of reimagining the future is really, it's a large consultation project informed by evidence, is essentially the background to it. And that will involve primarily external people to Sport New Zealand. It's not we're not the ones that are reimagining it. Our sector and system is reimagining it as we go. What that looks like, well, we will wait and see how big the change is. We will wait and see. Justin?
Thank you, Justin. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the only thing to add to that is that Sport New Zealand genuinely is committed to being open about what the future might look like. That we are, as the custodians of the physical activity world in New Zealand and the leading government agency or Crown agency responsible for that, we are open and keen to see what new and novel things have not just come from COVID, but may also be on the horizon for us. How can we actually do things differently to improve on what we've already had? And I think that's particularly exciting. I think it's a sign of where Sport New Zealand is. It's a progressive organisation that is open to looking at opportunity to be better. And so that'd be the only thing I'd add to that. It's almost a sales point for Sport New Zealand, but it's certainly it's a great place to work because of the way they think like that.
Great, thank you. Is there anything else that you would like to add that I haven't asked?
Probably the one thing I'd probably like to add is to Justin's earlier comments around ASPA. It is really exciting when we think about how we translate research to policy, and the learnings is really the key, but how we're learning from each other to do that. I think there's often a case that we try things without looking first who's done it already and what they've learned. So I'm really hopeful that we can do that shared learning regionally, which would be really exciting.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you both very much for your time. Greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you. Tēnā koutou.